What if the person you think is losing interest in you is actually the one feeling the most? And what if their distance is not rejection, but the moment they are closest to emotional overwhelm? Because when an avoidant loves you, they do not move in straight lines. They move in patterns you can easily misread, and if you don't understand this, you may walk away from something real. Have you ever experienced someone becoming distant right after a deep emotional moment? Or someone who returns after pulling away, leaving you confused about what they truly feel? That confusion is exactly what we are going to understand here. If an avoidant loves you, they may hurt you in the very moments when they feel closest to you. And the sign that they care the most is often the one people wrongly take as rejection. If you ignore this pattern, you might walk away from real love without ever realizing what it actually was. Because what looks like distance on the surface is not always distance in feeling. Sometimes it is the opposite. And if this is reminding you of someone you loved, or even yourself, then pay attention to what follows, because this is where most people start to misunderstand the emotional reality behind avoidant behavior and mistake protection for lack of love. Pause for a moment and reflect on this carefully, because what we are talking about is not simple behavior. It is emotional wiring shaped by past experiences. Many people are never taught how complex love can look when someone is not emotionally secure. This is why I want you to stay with this and understand it fully. If this topic is hitting something familiar inside you, take a moment and subscribe right now, because what we are breaking down here is the hidden psychology behind attachment patterns and the things people usually realize too late after they have already walked away from something meaningful. One of the hardest truths to accept about loving an avoidant person is that their love may not resemble love in the way you were taught to recognize it. From childhood and experience, most people are conditioned to believe that love means consistency, closeness, emotional expression, reassurance, and steady presence. So when someone becomes distant after an intimate moment, or quiet after emotional vulnerability, or suddenly pulls back when things start feeling real, it naturally feels like rejection or disinterest. It can feel confusing, painful, and even like the connection was never real to begin with, even though something deeper may still be happening beneath that surface behavior. The problem begins when we interpret emotional distance as emotional absence. When an avoidant person starts pulling away, it is easy to assume they are simply losing interest, or that they never cared deeply enough. But for many avoidant individuals, closeness does not feel safe in the way others expect it to feel. Instead of comfort, it can trigger internal alarm. Emotional intimacy can activate old fears related to dependence, loss of control, being overwhelmed, or even being hurt again. So in moments when connection becomes stronger, their nervous system may react as if something is wrong, even when everything on the surface feels right. Because of this internal reaction, their behavior can suddenly shift in ways that confuse the person they care about. After a moment of emotional closeness, they may withdraw, become quieter, or seem emotionally unavailable. This does not always mean they are leaving the connection. Instead, it can mean they are trying to regulate themselves after feeling too exposed. From the outside, it appears inconsistent, but internally, it is often a struggle between wanting connection and trying to protect themselves from what that connection brings up inside them emotionally. When an avoidant person does not feel strong emotional attachment, their distance is usually steady and predictable. There is no confusion because there is no internal conflict. But when they do care, things become more complicated. They may overthink messages, hesitate after emotional exchanges, or suddenly become distant after moments of closeness. Not because the feeling disappeared, but because emotional vulnerability triggered discomfort. This is what makes the experience so painful for the other person, because love and distance start appearing together at the same time, creating emotional confusion. This is where many people misinterpret the situation entirely. They believe that if someone truly loved them, they would naturally come closer and stay close. But for an avoidant person, closeness can feel overwhelming, even when love is present. So the same connection they desired earlier can suddenly feel like pressure. This creates a push and pull dynamic, where one part of them wants intimacy while another part resists it. It is not always a conscious decision. It is often an automatic emotional response, shaped by earlier experiences with closeness and safety. This is why the hot and cold pattern can be so misleading. People often assume that withdrawal means the absence of love. But sometimes withdrawal is what happens when love and fear exist at the same time. If you only focus on the distance, you miss the internal conflict happening underneath it. The push and pull is not always manipulation or confusion on purpose. Sometimes it is the result of someone feeling deeply connected, but not having the emotional tools to stay present when vulnerability increases. When an avoidant person truly loves someone, they rarely express it in obvious or dramatic ways. Their expression of love does not always match what society shows as romantic behavior. Instead, their love often appears through small actions that involve emotional risk. These actions may seem simple from the outside, but internally they carry weight. Because for someone who is used to protecting their emotions, even small steps toward openness can feel significant and uncomfortable at the same time. For example, when they initiate contact without a practical reason, it may not look special to others, but it can be a meaningful step for them. When they send a message just to check in, or remember something small you once said, or allow a conversation to become personal instead of staying on the surface, these moments often reflect emotional movement. They are not always grand gestures, but they often represent a willingness to stay connected despite internal resistance. That is why they matter more than they appear to on the surface. Love in an avoidant person is often revealed through what they allow themselves to show. Sometimes it appears when they share something personal that they normally keep hidden. Sometimes it appears when they admit fear, insecurity, or emotional confusion that they do not easily express to others. These moments may seem small or ordinary if you do not understand the deeper emotional structure behind them. But for someone who is emotionally guarded, opening up even slightly can require significant internal effort. People often underestimate these small openings because they are expecting love to look loud, consistent, and obvious. But in avoidant attachment, vulnerability is not casual. It is not something that is freely given without internal struggle. It is something that goes against their natural defense system. This is why emotional exposure, even in small amounts, can actually represent deeper intimacy than repeated expressions without emotional risk. Because vulnerability always means something has been lowered that usually stays protected. In the end, what makes this so difficult to understand is that love and fear can exist at the same time inside the same person. One part wants connection, while another part tries to avoid the discomfort that connection brings. So instead of a straight emotional path, you get mixed signals, distance after closeness, and silence after intimacy. But if you only judge it from the outside, you miss the internal experience completely. And sometimes, what looks like walking away is actually someone trying to stay close in the only way they know how, without losing themselves in the process. Sometimes the risk is even quieter than that. They may allow you to see them in moments when they are not strong, when they are overwhelmed, confused, or struggling internally. For someone who has built their identity around self-reliance, this is not a small thing. It can actually be one of the most difficult forms of emotional exposure. They may also ask you for help, even in small ways, which might not seem significant on the surface, but for them it can feel like breaking an internal rule they have lived by for years. That kind of moment is not casual. It is emotional permission being given, even if they themselves do not fully recognize it. They may slowly include you in parts of their life that are usually private. This can be routines, thoughts about the future, or personal spaces they normally keep protected. These are not random actions or meaningless gestures. They are signs that trust is being built in layers. Avoidant love is often not revealed through smooth, consistent closeness. Instead, it is shown through repeated attempts to stay connected even when discomfort rises. They move closer, then hesitate, then try again. They share something small, then retreat, then return later with something slightly deeper. From the outside, this may look inconsistent, but internally, it is often a slow process of learning how to tolerate emotional closeness. This is why emotional risk becomes such an important signal. Many people can express affection when it feels safe or easy, but when an avoidant person does something that makes them feel exposed or emotionally visible, that moment carries more weight than it appears to. It might be a confession, a moment of honesty, or even a simple admission of vulnerability. These are not dramatic declarations, but they are meaningful because they go against their natural defense system. What matters is not how perfect the expression is, but how much internal resistance had to be overcome for it to happen. When an avoidant person begins to feel strong emotional attachment, something complicated often starts to happen inside them. The relationship does not simply become calmer or more stable. In many cases, emotional tension actually increases. This is where confusion begins for many people, because they assume that deeper love should naturally feel more secure and less uncertain. But for someone with avoidant patterns, stronger emotional attachment can activate stronger internal defenses at the same time. This happens because intimacy creates internal conflict. One part of them moves toward closeness because attachment is forming. Another part pulls back because closeness feels emotionally unsafe. They may think about you often, miss you deeply, and feel drawn toward you, yet still create distance at the exact moment the relationship starts feeling more serious. This contradiction is not accidental. It is what happens when emotional desire and emotional fear exist together in the same experience. In the beginning, when the connection still feels light and non-demanding, they may appear more open, more engaged, even more expressive. But as emotional depth increases and the bond starts to feel real and lasting, internal protective systems can activate. This is when behavior may shift. They can become more difficult to read, less consistent, or more withdrawn. Not because their feelings have disappeared, but because those feelings have become strong enough to trigger emotional alarm. The mind begins to associate closeness with risk, even when the present moment does not actually contain danger. This is why moments of intimacy are sometimes followed by emotional distance. A deep conversation might be followed by silence. A meaningful emotional exchange might be followed by withdrawal. Even warmth can be followed by irritation or detachment. From the perspective of the partner, this can feel confusing or even hurtful, as if the connection is being pushed away right after it is built. But often, what is happening is not rejection of the person, but a reaction to the emotional exposure that intimacy creates inside them. The fear behind this reaction is not always simple. Sometimes it is fear of losing independence or sense of self inside a relationship. Sometimes it is fear of becoming emotionally dependent. Sometimes it is fear of disappointing the other person or not being able to maintain emotional closeness over time. As the relationship deepens, these fears can become stronger, not weaker, because the emotional stakes are now higher. For an avoidant person, love does not automatically create calmness in the nervous system. In fact, it can sometimes create the opposite effect. Emotional closeness can feel activating rather than soothing. This is why the push and pull pattern often becomes more intense when feelings deepen. One side is pulling them toward connection through attachment. The other side is pushing them away through fear. Both reactions are happening at the same time, creating internal tension that can be difficult to understand from the outside. This internal movement is actually important to notice. Emotional indifference tends to feel stable and flat. There is no internal conflict visible because there is no strong attachment involved. But when someone cares deeply while also feeling unsafe, there is movement. There is reaching, pulling back, returning again, and hesitating in between. That rhythm can feel painful, but it often indicates that emotional investment is present, even if it is not being expressed in a steady way. Many people assume that inconsistency automatically means shallow feeling, but that is not always true. Sometimes inconsistency reflects deep emotional ambivalence created by attachment wounds. The avoidant person is not always simply deciding whether they want the relationship or not. More often, they are struggling with whether they feel emotionally safe enough to stay fully inside it. And that difference is important, because it changes how the behavior should be understood. When you understand this internal conflict, the push and pull pattern stops looking like random confusion. It starts to look like what can happen when love activates emotional systems that were never fully resolved. It is not always about lack of care. Sometimes it is about fear being triggered by care itself. And that is where misunderstanding often begins. One of the most common mistakes people make is assuming that if love is real, it will always be expressed clearly and verbally. People are taught to look for words, emotional openness, reassurance, and visible affection as the main signs of love. But avoidant individuals often express attachment in ways that are less direct and less emotionally exposed. If you only look for verbal confirmation, you may miss the ways they are already showing care in action. For them, love is often communicated through protection rather than expression. They may not easily say that they need you, but they might still make sure you are safe. They may not express deep emotional statements, but they remember things that matter to you or things that affect your well-being. They may not speak in emotionally intense language, but they show up when something goes wrong or when support is needed. These behaviors may seem simple, but they often carry emotional meaning that is easy to overlook. In many cases, practical care feels safer than emotional exposure. Doing something helpful can feel less threatening than verbally revealing deep feelings. So their love may appear through actions that focus on stability, responsibility, and support. They might help you solve problems, stay reliable during difficult moments, or quietly support you in ways that reduce stress in your life. These actions are often consistent, even if emotional expression is not. This is why consistency in care can sometimes reveal more than words. An avoidant person may not say they miss you frequently, but they may still notice subtle changes in your mood or behavior. They may not express emotion openly, but they may become more attentive when you are struggling. They may not declare love in obvious ways, but they may continue to show up in practical and reliable forms. This is not absence of emotion. It is emotion translated into behavior that feels safer for them. Many avoidant individuals learned early in life that emotional dependence felt unsafe, while being helpful or useful felt more acceptable. Because of this, they may express attachment through actions like remembering details, offering help, providing support, or being present in moments of difficulty. These behaviors become their way of staying connected without feeling emotionally overwhelmed. If these forms of care are misunderstood as ordinary or unimportant simply because they are not emotionally expressive, then real signs of attachment may be missed entirely. Sometimes the person who struggles to express love directly is still showing it consistently through quiet actions that protect, support, and stay present in ways that are easy to overlook. But internally there may be anxiety, guilt, confusion, longing, and emotional flooding happening all at once. What appears on the outside as coldness is sometimes actually someone trying to manage emotions that feel too intense to hold at that moment. This is important because avoidant individuals do not always withdraw when they feel less. In many cases, they withdraw precisely because they feel too much. That is the paradox. The deeper the emotional bond becomes, the more exposed they can feel inside, and that exposure can quickly turn into internal panic. Not always a conscious, clear panic, but a quiet emotional overload that shows up as shutting down, becoming distant, disappearing for a while, or needing sudden space without being able to fully explain why. These behaviors can easily be interpreted as rejection from the outside. But internally, what is happening may be very different. There can be fear of being emotionally consumed, fear of disappointing the other person, fear of losing independence, fear of becoming too dependent, and even fear that closeness will eventually lead to pain or abandonment. When these fears are activated, withdrawal often becomes a coping mechanism. It is not necessarily a message that love is gone, but rather a way of trying to reduce emotional intensity that feels overwhelming in the moment. The system is trying to calm itself down by creating distance, even if the connection is still important underneath. This is why distance in someone who is avoidant but attached often comes with inner tension rather than peace. On the surface, they may seem withdrawn, quiet, or emotionally unavailable. But internally, they may still be thinking about the person, replaying conversations, feeling conflicted about their own behavior, or even feeling guilty about pulling away. They might miss the connection while also resisting it at the same time. This creates an internal contradiction where leaving does not bring full relief and staying does not feel fully safe either. So they exist in a state of emotional push and pull even when they are physically away. Sometimes silence is not emotional emptiness. It can be a state filled with fear, confusion, and emotional overload. When someone pulls away, it is not always about escaping the person, but about escaping the intensity that closeness creates inside them. If this is misunderstood, internal overwhelm can easily be mistaken for lack of care, when in reality, the distance may reflect how strongly the connection is actually being felt. When you look at the overall pattern, one of the clearest signs of attachment in avoidant behavior is not perfect consistency, but the return after distance. Many people focus only on withdrawal because it feels painful and final, but they miss what comes after. These returns, even when small or indirect, often show that emotional connection has not disappeared. A person who feels nothing usually does not come back repeatedly, but someone who is still attached often does, even if it is inconsistent or hesitant. These repeated returns are not always fully planned or conscious. They can feel like being pulled back towards something they are still trying to manage internally. That is why patterns matter more than single moments. One message or one withdrawal does not define the relationship, but repeated movement back toward connection often shows that something is still active underneath. In avoidant patterns, this can become one of the clearest signs that attachment is still present, even if it is not expressed in a stable or direct way. In the end, what we often call confusion in love is sometimes just a lack of understanding of emotional patterns. Not every distance means absence, and not every return means clarity. Some people move closer and then step back, not because they do not care, but because they are trying to manage emotions they do not fully understand within themselves. But understanding these patterns is not about excusing pain or ignoring your own emotional needs. Real connection is not meant to stay in cycles of uncertainty forever. It should gradually move toward clarity, stability, and mutual understanding. If it does not, then awareness becomes important so you can see things as they are, not as you hope them to be. So the real lesson is simple. Pay attention to patterns, not just moments. Understand behavior, but also respect your own emotional boundaries. And most importantly, recognize when a connection is still growing through struggle and when it is no longer able to give you the peace and consistency you deserve.